Hi there. Welcome back to the Out of the Cave podcast with Lisa Schlossberg. I'm your host, Lisa Schlossberg, a licensed social worker, certified health coach, personal trainer, and yoga instructor. If you, like I have, struggle with your relationship with food, eating, and body image, I am here with this podcast to guide you into healing the relationship you have with yourself through a trauma-informed, holistic, and mind-body-soul approach. Together, we can support you in building a lifestyle of more peace, freedom, safety, and power. Hello, and welcome back to the Out of the Cave podcast. This is me, your host, Lisa Schlossberg, and today we are back with episode 37 of the solo series. And I am, as usual, stoked to be here. I'm here on a Wednesday afternoon, which is, I don't know, who is she recording a podcast on a Wednesday afternoon? But today, it's just one of those times I was sitting through my morning meetings and I had that feeling again of I'm pregnant and the baby is coming. So here we are giving birth to episode 37. So I want to kind of just dive in again because there is, as usual, quite a bit I want to get to. So I'm going to start with some follow-up thoughts on the previous episode and then continue from there as usual. So thank you for being here. As always, pleasure to have you. Let's get into it. All right. So my first follow-up thought after listening to the previous episode, which, usually I do the day of, but I listened to it a couple days ago and I didn't revisit it this morning because I just have too many notes at this point. And I'm practicing some surrender. I'm practicing some releasing it. If it didn't make it through the follow-up, if it didn't make it to the follow-up thoughts upon the first listen, maybe it just wasn't meant to be in this episode. So we're flowing with it. But the first thing I thought of was on the conversation about allowing yourself to tell the truth about the fact that you're mad or upset while maintaining connection and clarity that it doesn't change the amount of love, okay? And I feel like I can't emphasize enough how important this is to allow yourself to feel the anger and to know that you are equally as loved and lovable despite the presence of anger. And again, I think this is important because as you set goals and set intentions, and we're going to get, again, more kind of granular with things like intentional weight loss and a calorie deficit and things like that. But I think this is really important because there are sometimes going to be times where you say, this is what I'm going to eat. And then you eat maybe more than that. And then you're upset with yourself about it. And it's these things where usually if you are getting upset with yourself or you're getting upset about how you behaved, that's what turns it into a shame spiral and you judging yourself and being really mean and critical to yourself, which I had a client just this morning share. In her words, it's like pouring gasoline on a fire. Okay, so the reason this all matters is because it's inevitable that you're going to piss yourself off. And instead of pouring gasoline on that fire, which already doesn't feel good, you already acted out of alignment. You already, blew past the boundary that you set for yourself. That doesn't feel good. But then on top of that, making yourself feel even worse, that's definitely not going to feel good. And then the reason it matters that it feels like gasoline on a fire is because that's not safe, which means it's not sustainable. So if you want something like intentional weight loss to be sustainable, you are going to have to allow yourself to have moments where you're mad and knowing that doesn't mean anything about you. In fact, it's an opportunity to practice that tender self-compassion that is, it's really hard. It's really hard sometimes to be in that moment where I had a boundary, I completely blew past it, and I don't feel that good about that right now. Maybe I feel ashamed of that. Maybe I feel sad about that. I feel angry about that. That's tender self-compassion opportunities where you can, again, create safety and feel loved by yourself in that. Okay, so all of this I'm reiterating, but what I thought of when I was listening to it was I remember when I was getting my master's for social work in my second year human behavior class. I had a really great professor for this one. And when we had our module on couples therapy, I remember her saying, you know, the biggest red flag from the therapist perspective is when you have a couple come in that says, we never fight. We never have any issues. We never have conflict. And I think there's an important distinction here. It's not a problem if you never fight, meaning you never, because everyone has a different definition of what it means to quote unquote fight. It's not a problem if you're saying we never get violent with each other, right? That's not a problem. But if what that means, or you saying we never fight means we never have conflict, we never have tension between us, that's the red flag. Because what that indicates is all of it's being brushed under the rug. Because I don't think there is any way for two human beings to be in a relationship where there is zero conflict, where there is zero tension. I mean, sometimes you want this, they want that. That's a relationship. That's life. But so if we are pushing that aside, no, that never happens. And very often we're doing this with ourselves. Is either we feel really bad about something and then we shame spiral about it and we pour that gasoline on the fire, or, and I would say that to me, that aligns a little bit more with like the kind of diet culture perspective and energy, or we kind of swing the opposite way to the other side of the spectrum, a little bit closer related, in my opinion, to an anti-diet approach that is like, no, we just won't look at it. We just don't look at it. It's not a problem. But it's not a problem because a problem doesn't exist. It's a problem because we're not acknowledging the problem that exists, okay? So similar, when we don't know how to allow, and we don't feel safe to allow things like anger or even shame to show up, that's what ends up happening, is that it's almost like we're in a relationship with ourselves being like, there's no tension, there's no conflict. No, it feels good all the time. That's the biggest red flag. That's what you want to remember. And that's what I thought of when I was listening to this last episode about couples therapy. But obviously everything that exists in relationship, we're talking about here in your intrapersonal relationship with yourself. So if you notice that you do that the way I definitely used to do that, that's where it's super valid. It's okay, because, the reason that, that's driving that is that it doesn't feel safe. That's why it matters that you can say, I feel angry and I feel upset and I still love you just as much. And then that allows you to bring up the tension and the conflict and the rupture so that you have an opportunity to repair. Okay, so that's completing the thought from the previous episode. Now, the other thing that I thought of, and I always come back to with this example of being mad or being upset or disappointed, but knowing that it doesn't change how much you love or don't love someone, I think about our pets, because this can be a really hard thing to practice on ourselves. It can also be a hard thing to practice on other people. And so I think sometimes, depending on your relationship with animals, the lowest hanging fruit is thinking about this in relationship with a pet. And so I always just think of the example of like, if you have a dog and you come home and you see that like your dog chewed up your sneakers or something, you might be really pissed off, right? But at the same moment that you know how angry you are, you're not questioning whether you still love your dog or not. You know that you love your dog. You know that your love for your dog is not diminished at all by how angry you are at your dog. And sometimes, again, just seeing it with animals, it could be like, oh, well, yeah, that's true. I don't love my dog any less, but I'm super pissed about what they just did. That's the kind of thing that you get to now practice turning inward for yourself. That is, yeah, I don't love you any less. And also, I hate that I have to deal with the fact that I just did this thing. Okay? All of it. The other example I think of, again, if this is just take what works, leave the rest. But I think also about little kids, where if you have a kid, you have a little child, and the classic example of, maybe they found your markers and they took them to the wall. And you walk downstairs and you see now there is a mural that you didn't ask for and didn't want. And in that moment, you might be furious. And also, in that moment, you don't love your child any less. You're just really mad about the thing they did and the mess you now have to clean up. But all of that gets to coexist, okay? So the same thing internally, again, is what you get to practice. Okay, now, having said all of that, another thought that I had that I just felt like I couldn't not share here in response to or in addition to the previous episode is when I'm talking about the innocence and the seeing yourself as innocent and seeing that you have, powers that you just didn't know how to channel in a healthy, stable way. I was just thinking about Dr. Dick Schwartz, who created IFS, which is Internal Family Systems. Many of you know this, but his book is called No Bad Parts. And it's really about how the parts that we have, the behaviors that we have that show up that we sometimes don't like and that cause us pain and suffering, it's about seeing them as well-intentioned. It's about seeing that their intention is to be helpful or to be supportive, to be motivating, to be, to help us in some way. And that's really the energy to me that drives the intervention of internal family systems, that model of therapy, is seeing that there are no bad parts. They are innocent. They are good. They are, in their very nature and essence, they are good and they are innocent. And so the reason that, parts work shows up so much around this, the reason that IFS, in my opinion, is so useful with this kind of work is because it has that same orientation. That is, it's a non-pathologizing approach. It's non-shaming. And that's what all of that means, is that we're coming at it from the, the clinician standpoint, the clinician perspective, is we're not judging the parts or the behaviors as fundamentally inherently bad, but rather seeing their good nature and then being curious about it from that point. So again, just throwing it out there, if you're not familiar with Dick Schwartz, if you're not familiar with his book, it's all just kind of bringing it together with IFS. That's why this approach works. And then the last follow-up thought that I had, I'm doing good. It's only 12 minutes so far. So the last follow-up thought that I had, though, was really bringing me back to, it was my second year of my MSW program, and I gave a keynote speech at an eating disorder clinic in Manhattan. And some of the other speakers there, some of you have heard me talk about this. I'm sure I will say much more on the Patreon, because this is something I really find myself going back to in terms of formative memories. But anyway, I don't want to get too distracted. I gave this speech, and some of the other women that were speaking also were very kind of anti-diet, intuitive eating folk, and I know I've mentioned it briefly here, but one of the things that really stood out to me that I'm going to focus on this time is at the end of this event, we did a panel. So people could ask questions, and then, it was me and a few of them answering the questions. And what I remember was sharing at one point that, I lost all my weight sophomore year of college, and then I graduated my senior year, and I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. So I became a personal trainer, and I was excited to work in a gym helping people. And I remember sharing that, and I think it was maybe the mediator of the Q&A who said something to me about, he made a comment about, was that really a good idea? Or was that, was it safe for me to be helping other people with nutrition and their bodies and exercise? given where I was just coming from, because I was the first to acknowledge that I was not in a healthy place with myself, really. I mean, I was trying. I knew that I was, intending to eat more and exercise less, and I was in the process of recovering and stabilizing. But it was really when I felt like I kind of had one foot in either door. I was weight obsessed in some ways, but I also was now like not getting on the scale because I was practicing abstinence from the scale. Like I was trying to stop counting calories and take more rest days, and I was doing the things, but I was still scared. And so I'm saying this because I remember being met with that kind of reaction that was like, do you really think it was a good idea for you to be a personal trainer when you were struggling with all this yourself? And it had, maybe I'm assuming things, but it felt to me like it had this energy of judgment around it and ultimately fear. And I really resent that. I really did at the time, and I still do. And what I want to say about it is the reason that I resent it so much is not because I felt really called out or I didn't feel, I don't know. I mean, the truth is, like, I didn't feel like he was right. I felt like he had no idea who he was talking to, because at that point in my life, yes, I was a personal trainer and I was helping other people, but my intention was so recovery focused. So what I remember doing, and I said this to you guys episodes ago about when I was a personal trainer, I was using it as a way to help me recover with my own stuff. And so I knew that if I wouldn't tell a client to do this, I also wasn't going to do it. If that workout was too much for any of my clients, that was also too much for me. If I looked at what I was eating and I thought, if a client showed me this, what would I think? And I would say, that's not enough food. Then I would force myself to eat more. I was using being a personal trainer as a way for me to learn how to hold myself accountable to those standards that I hold for other people, instead of where a lot of my disordered eating came from, which is I'm the exception to the rule. Maybe you need that much food, but I don't. Maybe you can't work out that much, but I can. I am the exception. I am a superhero. Instead of all of that, it was using all of those things I was learning about how to take care of and help other people that I was turning inward toward myself. And that was so helpful along the road of recovery. And so when I hear someone say, do you really think it was a good idea for you to be helping other people when you were struggling so much? Yes, I do, actually, because I really did help other people and I really did help myself. And so the reason I'm saying this here now, and I thought of it while I was listening to the last episode, is because this is where it becomes, for me, like the intention is not being seen. My parts, myself, me, I am not being seen in my innocence, in my intention, and it's met with judgment and fear. And again, I understand why, and it's super valid why. It makes all the sense in the world that you might hear about what I was struggling with internally and think, well, you can't possibly help other people. You're not a safe presence. You're not trustworthy. When the truth is, that's your story based on your experience. That's not my story or my experience. And I think the reason this matters so much in this conversation, and I will say more about it later in this episode, is that we take on the cultural narrative, not consciously, but it's like we hear that kind of message that is, you're not safe, you're not trustworthy, We can't give you this kind of power and responsibility because you'll hurt people with it. You'll hurt yourself with it. Look at everything you've done so far. You can't be trusted. We hear that. We are met with that, whether we know it or not, and take that in and then have that reaction and response towards ourselves. And what that then translates to is, and again, I'm going to say more about this, what then it feels like is I can't trust myself. I'm not reliable. And it's very much building on the last episode. It's like Elsa and her powers. The tragedy is not that she has power. The tragedy is that she learns that her powers are not safe because no one ever helped her learn how to use them. And it's the same kind of thing. I felt like I was a personal trainer who had power, who had knowledge, who had intention and innocence. And I wasn't trying to hurt anyone else or trying to hurt myself. And at this point, I wasn't. But I think that is what matters here, is I think the reason that I felt so resentful of that comment was not only because I'm not being seen. You are judging me the way other people. I know personal trainers who are deep in their eating disorder and want to stay there and have no intention of recovering. I know some of those people, but that's not at all where I was. So not only am I not being seen, but now I'm being met with this fear and judgment that has me question myself. Am I trustworthy? Am I safe? Do I know what I'm doing here? Am I hurting people? And again, for me, I was able to be like, yeah, no, you just don't know me. You just don't know who you're talking to. You just don't know what's going on over here. That's not my story. And so I was able to do that. But I think, that's what I want to invite and give you a permission slip to also practice. That is when when the world is looking at you like you're a monster because you had ice powers that you didn't know how to use as a kid. Can we not? Can we see that and put that down in that third space? Let's give that to God. That is someone else's judgment. And can we see that we are innocent? Again, doesn't mean all our behaviors are harmless. It means that our nature, our essence is pure, is good. No bad parts. That's what it all comes back to. Okay, now I'm going to use this as a segue to this episode where the first thing I want to talk about is the distinction between impact and intention. Now, I know I've said these words a few times, and I want to kind of create an opening to elaborate a bit. Impact is the impact that you have, that your words have, that your behaviors have, that your tone has. Okay, that's the impact. How does it impact other people? The intention is the intention. Well, what did you mean by it? And what were you trying to communicate or get across? And so sometimes this can show up as if you feel insulted by something, that's the impact. I feel insulted. And then someone says, I didn't mean that as an insult. I meant that as a compliment. Sometimes you could be like, oh, wait, really? How did you see that as a compliment? And then maybe they explain, well, the way I see it is this, and this. It's actually, I'm paying you a compliment. Sometimes having that intention clarified is like, oh, well, okay, well, now I feel pretty good about it, Sometimes hearing about the intention can shift what happens on the impact side of things. Okay. Not always, though. Not always. Sometimes someone says something and you feel insulted by it, and then they say, I didn't mean that as an insult. And it's like, well, whether you meant it as one or not, I feel hurt by that. Okay? So there's a difference between the impact and the intention. And sometimes hearing about the intention shifts things. Sometimes it doesn't. It's just the way of it. Now, I'm going to say a few things about this. Number one, I think that when it comes to this conversation that I'm having with you today about your relationship with yourself and your parts, intention matters tremendously. And before I get into saying more about that, first, I think we can acknowledge that this is not at all the culture that we live in. So think about, like, if you grew up and you broke a rule, either at home or at school, or what happened when you broke a rule? If you said, I didn't mean to, some of the time it's like, well, listen, whether you meant to or not, you did. I think about like speeding, like a traffic ticket, okay, is if you're driving and you are going 20 miles over the speed limit and you get pulled over and the police officer is like, you're going 20 miles over the speed limit, here's a ticket. And you're like, but I didn't mean to. That police officer has every reason to be like, well, that sucks for you. And also it's the law and you're getting a ticket. Okay? This is the world that we live in. Your intention doesn't always matter. And sometimes, I think about, like, depending on where I am, I have definitely had the thought before where I'm like, well, if I get pulled over, it's like, I haven't seen a speed limit sign and I don't know how long. I mean, I could just say, I didn't know any better. I didn't know. And it's like, still, it doesn't matter if you didn't know. If you're over the speed limit, you're getting a ticket. And that's that. And that's valid because that's the world that we live in. But I think about, how this extends to, like, the law, right? Is if your intention, if you break a law, is something like, well, I didn't know. Okay, well, you still broke a law and you're still going to be, in trouble for that. But even if you know that you're breaking a law and your intention is still good, right? I'm fighting for what I believe in. I'm fighting for human rights. It's like, okay, well, you're still doing something that you're not allowed to do. And you're still trespassing. You're still, soliciting. You're still doing something that you can get in trouble for. And that's how our culture works. And it doesn't really matter what your intention is. So I'm just saying that because you could find a lot of examples where you might be able to say to me, Lisa, it doesn't really matter what my intention is. It's the impact that matters the most. And I will say to you, you're absolutely right, but that's not the conversation we're having right now. So on that same note, I cannot talk about impact and intention without also nodding at things like not just social justice, but if we look at equality and something like racism and microaggressions. Microaggressions are a really good example of something where someone might say, well, that wasn't my intention. I didn't mean for it to sound racist. And it's like, okay. And also it did. And you need to also be aware of and take responsibility for the impact of your statement, even if it wasn't the intention. Okay. So again, there's nuance, there's complexity here. There are definitely scenarios where your impact, we could argue, matters more than your intention. And there are times where it can feel like your intention doesn't mean jack shit in the conversation. All of that is valid, and all of that is not what we're here to talk about. What I am here to talk to you about is how to relate to yourself in an internal family systems kind of way, and what it means around impact and intention there. Okay, with that being said, what I'm here obviously to talk to you about is what I have seen work with me and many of my clients when it comes to having conversations kind of internally and, building on there's a part that's angry, but there's still love, allowing ourselves to feel the feelings, even if they're not comfortable and we don't like them. Okay, so one kind of tactic in IFS therapy that has come up very much in my own therapy sessions is, for example, asking a part or a feeling if it's willing to kind of tone down the volume a little bit. So, for example, if I feel really flooded with, again, anger or overwhelm, so much so that it feels like really intense to my system, what my therapist might say to me is, let's see if it's possible if we ask that part to just quiet the volume down a little bit, like bring the charge down a little bit, see how it goes. And I remember in the beginning of working with my therapist who does this, kind of work with me, I remember being absolutely blown away because I experienced, as I'm sure many of you have that are listening to this, I experienced that just asking that question, I actually felt like the anger or the overwhelm kind of bring itself down a little bit. And it was like amazing to me that all I had to do was ask if it was willing to quiet down a little bit. And so sometimes it's that easy. Sometimes it's not that easy. But the reason I'm using this as an example around intention is because I've also experienced, if I turn toward a part of me and I say, would you mind quieting down a little bit? Sometimes the reaction is like, don't tell me what to do. No, I'm not quieting down a little bit. You fucking quiet down. Like it can get real, it can get kind of reactive that way. And here's the important part about this is I can get a sense now in my own system that if I ask a part of me if it's willing to quiet down, if it thinks that my intention is to quiet it down and mute it and get it out of here because I don't want to hear what it has to say, that's when it'll be like, no, I'm not quieting down. I have something to say. Why aren't you listening? Or whatever else it's going to turn into. But if I clarify that my intention is, would you mind bringing the volume down a little bit because I really want to hear what you have to say. And when you're screaming that loud, I can't hear what you're saying. It's really hard for me to stay present with you and focused when you're reacting in such an intensity. And so my intention in asking you to quiet down is for me to actually be even deeper connected to you. That's when it's like, oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, I can quiet down because you want to hear I can still tell you what I have to say. Of course you can tell me what you have to say. I want to know what you have to say. This is how we start to work together. The intention changes everything. And now there are a couple other examples I could think of with this, but I think about, even when I first started practicing using touch around self-compassion, like tender self-compassion, like a hand on my heart or giving myself a hug or something like that, I used to think that putting my hand on my heart or even breathing into a sensation I feel in my body, it was always, not even consciously, but it was always accompanied by this kind of like unspoken, unidentified general sense of I'm doing this with the hope that you'll go away. And this is, again, as you've heard me say, part of the reason I love this shit is because you cannot bullshit yourself. If you are moving toward yourself, relating to yourself with the energy of conditional love, which is fear, which is I will connect with this feeling if it goes away. You can feel that. You can feel that. That feeling that you want to go away, it knows that. And so that's where it doesn't feel loving and accepting because you're not being loving and accepting. You're only being loving and accepting if it promises to behave the way you want it to. That's not love and acceptance. That's coercion and manipulation. So all of that to say, then at a certain point, I started to realize and be taught, no, I'm putting a hand on my heart, not to get that emotional energy to dissolve or to disappear, but because I'm letting it know that I'm connecting with it. And my intention in taking a deep breath and breathing into the sensations in my body are not to get them to shift and change, but to actually presence with them, to create space for them to be here exactly as they are. Now it's like, okay. So my point in all of this is sometimes in the relationship you have with yourself and your parts, your intention is everything. Now, why is it important that you understand your intention? Well, it comes back to the previous episode because if you perceive your intention as guilty or bad, like that fundamentally bad, broken, defective, undesirable kind of thing, that if that's your perception of yourself, that's going to be how you experience that. But if you check in and wake up and realize / remember that your intention is innocent, your intention is good, then it means that you are safe to trust. This is now someone who is able to work with you. They're not against you. And so you might, if you only see the behavior itself, for example, and you judge that as bad or wrong, and you see yourself as guilty because you're the one who did it. Now, if you can, again, just kind of wake up and replace that with, okay, I still don't like the behavior. The consequences of the behavior still don't feel good to me. And I can see that I am innocent. Now you have you as someone who you can actually work with. Because if you see yourself, if you judge your behaviors and you make meaning of your behaviors that you don't like, that says you are inherently guilty and bad, you are not safe to work with. You are not trustworthy to work with. You can't rely on yourself because you are scary. You are out here doing things and you are fundamentally inherently bad and broken. You can't work with that. Why would you want to work with that? But if you can remember that you are innocent, your behaviors may not be harmless. You may not like your behaviors, but the person underneath all of it is fundamentally, inherently good and pure. Now you have safety to actually team up and be on the same team, be in one piece. Okay. So instead of, again, moving towards yourself with a like, can you quiet down? I don't want to hear you, but actually clarify, can you quiet down so that I can hear you? Now you have a working relationship, which is going to be the foundation for you moving forward with something like intentional weight loss in a way that is safe and sustainable. Now, the last thing I'm going to say on this is to genuinely ask yourself, and I really love doing this with my clients. It is so much easier when you have someone else doing this with you or for you, but I want to just throw it out there if I haven't at some point in the last 37 episodes to practice this. Next time you find yourself doing something that you kind of wish you aren't doing or weren't doing, or it's actually maybe easier to think about something that you've done in the past that now you see in hindsight was like, so silly or so ignorant of you or so, go back to that. And here's a perfect example of how this works. And it builds off of what I was saying, a couple episodes ago about it's not about what you're saying, just like it's not about what you're doing. It's about the energy with which you're doing it. It's not about what you're saying. It's about the energy with which you're saying it. So the same way, my dad would say, what are you, an idiot? It's like, I know that that's very loving. That's his way of being very loving. And I know that because of the energy. In our relationship, I could feel that. But here's what you can practice. If there's something that you did, if you ask the question, why did you do that? You have an opportunity here. You could do this from a place of judgment and fear, or you could do this from a place of love and compassionate curiosity. So again, back to that question, why? So if you're saying to yourself from a place of judgment, why did you do that? That can feel into your body how that feels. When you hear that, why did you do that? And very often this is what we do to ourselves around food. This is like pouring gasoline on that fire, right? And you can't get very far because when you don't feel safe, or the part of you that may be engaged in this behavior doesn't feel safe because it feels judged by you, it's not going to tell you the truth, or it's going to come up with some bullshit, or it's going to run in the other direction. Again. But if you change the energy with which you ask that question, if your intention is, no, I'm not judging you. I'm just genuinely curious. What inspired you to choose that? What inspired you to behave that way? Like, I genuinely want to know what was happening. That's when, if you are creating safety in that conversation with the energy with which you show up, now you can actually get some honest, truthful answers. And I think about, I had a session, I think about this all the time. I had a session with a client years ago where she was really coming down hard on herself for someone that she was in a relationship with decades earlier. And she kept saying things, like, why did I do that? Why did I do that? Why did I do that? And in our session together, I invited her to just switch up the energy, release the judgment, release the shame, and instead call in that compassionate curiosity. Ask the same question. Why did you do that? And it was amazing because as soon as she could do that in her body, physiologically, energetically, all these answers started coming through. Well, I just thought that if I dated him, that X, Y, and Z, and I just thought that maybe if I could this and that, and it was such an awakening in this moment because she was able to see, oh, it was so innocent. I was a young 20-something and he had so much status and he was so cool and I thought his friends were going to be my friends and I thought I thought it was a good idea at the time, right? And so often this is what we find. If we are willing to release the judgment and the fear and the shame and just get curious and say, well, why did I do that? I don't know. Let me see. Very often you'll find that what you are so afraid of is discovering your own innocence. And it reminds me again so much of our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is not our darkness. It's our light that we are afraid of. Right? The same idea is like we think that we are so bad, especially because again, this culture feeds us that message. But what I'm here to do is tell you, I think that if you are just willing to discover it for yourself, you will find innocence. You will find that there are no bad parts. You are good. It's just an unfamiliar heaven. So it can be hard to choose that. Okay, now, having said all of that, this is what I've been so excited to talk about, and I have so much to say, but finally we're here. Okay. This builds off of all of this conversation about intention and innocence and all of that. So we had to get that out of the way. But the reason that I want to come back to kind of the Venn diagram idea is because I want to say more about a lot of you being in alignment with yourself, especially you being in alignment with yourself if your goal is intentional weight loss, is going to look very similar on the surface to how your life looked when you were steeped in diet culture and potentially really harming and hurting yourself. So I want to come back to this idea, right? Is if you're eating a salad, if you're doing cardio, if you are employing some masculine energy, those things that exist in the middle of the Venn diagram. Well, how do you know if it's weight or health oriented? How do you know if it's love or fear, right? And we have to talk more about this because it's not about what you're doing. It's about the energy with which you're doing it. So to elaborate on this even more, because there are, as I was putting all these notes together, I realized there are so many of these examples that really get in the way for people. So I not created, but I want to insert here a general kind of framework for conceptualizing this. And then I will give you the more itemized bulleted list over probably the next few episodes. So the idea here is the concept of quote unquote near enemies. Near enemies. So to help me define this and clarify things a little bit more, I'm going to read you some of the things that I found online, and then I will elaborate. Okay, so I said to Chad, aka ChatGPT, I said, I know about the concept of near enemies from Brene Brown, but I believe it is a Buddhist concept. And Chad said, yes, near enemies is a concept from Buddhism that Brene Brown has referenced in her work, particularly when talking about courage, compassion, and authenticity. The idea is simple but profound. Agreed. A near enemy is something that looks and feels very similar to a virtue, but is actually a substitute that undermines it. It's near because it's easy to mistake for the real thing. Some classic examples include compassion and pity. Compassion says, I suffer with you. We are both human. Pity says, I am above you. Poor you. Pity creates distance. Compassion creates connection. The next example, loving kindness and attachment or possessiveness. This is something that comes up a lot around codependency, for example. Genuine love wants another person's well-being. Attachment often wants to reduce our own discomfort by holding on tightly. Okay. Equanimity and indifference. Equanimity is being deeply present without being overwhelmed. Indifference is being emotionally checked out. From the outside, they can both look calm, but internally they're completely different. Another really important one, empathy versus enmeshment. Empathy stays connected while maintaining boundaries. Enmeshment loses yourself in another person's emotions and often leads to burnout. Lastly, vulnerability and oversharing. Vulnerability is intentional, mutual, and rooted in trust. Oversharing seeks relief, validation, or connection before trust has been established. So, one of the reasons this teaching is so valuable is that it reminds us that our greatest obstacles are often not the obvious opposites of our values. They're convincing imitations of them. For example, we think we're being kind, but we're actually people-pleasing. We think we're being humble, but we're shrinking ourselves. We think we're practicing acceptance, but we've actually given up. We think we're being disciplined, but we're operating from self-punishment. We think we're practicing self-care, but we're avoiding discomfort. That's why they're called near enemies. They wear the clothing of their virtue while quietly moving us away from it. So, this is where Chad gets to know me really well. He says, knowing some of your work, I think this framework maps beautifully onto themes you've explored with your clients. Many behaviors that seem healthy, quote unquote, on the surface can actually be near enemies. So, this is where we're going with all this. Food tracking can become the near enemy of body awareness. Self-discipline can become the near enemy of self-respect. Weight loss can become the near enemy of healing if it's driven by shame rather than care. Independence can become the near enemy of authentic strength when it's actually a strategy to avoid vulnerability. So in practice, it is to keep asking. This is what it really, drives us toward. The question is, what is the deeper quality I'm actually trying to embody? And is this bringing me closer to it? Or is it just a convincing imitation? So I think personally, now I'm just going to speak for myself, this is where a lot of my beliefs around kind of anti-diet culture live, is that it has the intention to reject diet mentality and therefore connect you to your own freedom and your own inner peace. But does it really do that? Or does it just feel like more shame and judgment? And again, everyone has their own experience, but this is a helpful framework for me in interpreting my own, because that's how I experience it. Is I get what the intention is, but again, intention versus impact. The impact is, it doesn't feel that way to me. So it feels like near enemies. So in this conversation, here's where I take it. What I want to read to you is, diet culture and intentional health behaviors can look identical from the outside while arising from entirely different internal states. So this is everything I've been saying to you. This is the whole point of the Venn diagram, is the behaviors, whether it's for intentional health behaviors or intentional weight loss behaviors versus diet culture. They look exactly the same thing on the surface, but they arise from entirely different internal states. That's where the near enemies framework becomes so useful. For example, someone might count calories because they're terrified of gaining weight and believe they are only worthy of love if they are thin. Someone might count calories because they've intentionally chosen to lose weight in a way that supports their long-term health and they're using it as a temporary tool. The behavior is identical. The psychology is not. Likewise, someone skipping dessert because they're punishing themselves, or someone skipping dessert because they're genuinely satisfied, have a meaningful goal, and know that they'll enjoy something else later. Again, the same behavior, completely different consciousness. So, as we are talking about the anti-diet space, this is what it then shares. Sometimes we've become so focused on rejecting diet culture that we've started treating certain behaviors as inherently oppressive. Weighing yourself, tracking foods, wanting to lose weight, exercising consistently, saying no to a craving, delaying gratification. None of those behaviors are inherently healthy or unhealthy. They are morally neutral. What matters is the relationship you're bringing toward them. This is very consistent with your work. Yes, this is my work, okay? So this is the whole idea here, is thinking about the near enemies. And again, it's like if we perceive or judge that certain behaviors are inherently bad, then it's like judging ourselves as fundamentally guilty and judging ourselves as inherently fundamentally bad. And then again, you don't feel safe with that. You don't trust that. There's no room to collaborate with that. But if we can see that it's not the behaviors, it's not that weighing your food or tracking your food is necessarily inherently in all circumstances bad. It's that it was maybe in that circumstance, but it doesn't always have to be. Now there's some room to say, okay, well, how do I work with this? How do I team up with this? How do I integrate this? So I'm going to keep reading you some things. Chad says, where I think your insight gets especially interesting is that the near enemy isn't the behavior, it's the motivation. The near enemy of self-care isn't calorie tracking, it's control. The near enemy of discipline isn't consistency, it's self-punishment. The near enemy of intentional weight loss isn't having a goal, it's trying to earn your worth. The near enemy of commitment isn't saying no to yourself, it's abandoning yourself in the name of achievement. So, take this in. Conversely, the near enemy can exist on the other side too. Someone may say, I'm rejecting diet culture. Wonderful. Or, I'm rejecting every form of structure because structure reminds me of diet culture. Those are not the same thing. And again, this is what you want to pay attention to, because so much of where I'm going with this over the next few episodes is there are so many near enemies just like this. So the other one that shows up right here, avoiding all intentionality can become the near enemy of freedom. It can actually become another way of being controlled, this time by the fear of being controlled. This to me is how I understand anti-diet culture. It's avoiding all intentionality, right? It's that same idea of like, I'm rejecting all forms of structure because structure reminds me of diet culture. It's avoiding all forms of intentionality because it fears that that's what it was or it has been in the past. So that's why we need to pay attention to the near enemies framework, because if what you're doing with anti-diet culture messaging is rejecting diet culture, great, reject diet culture. But also, are you rejecting all the forms of things like structure, discipline, accountability that can be integrated in a safe way along with it? Because that's also not going to serve you very well. I'm going to just say another couple things because I think these are so good. It says, diet culture tells you what your body means. Sometimes anti-diet culture tells you what your body means too. Authenticity asks, what is true for me? And that's been my message from the start with diet culture, anti-diet culture, is neither of them are supporting you in getting back to yourself. They're telling you what to do or not do, but they're not asking any questions about how you are. So when you ask the question, what is true for me? How do I feel? That is a fundamentally different question. And now I can come back to, I will have to come back and say more about this, but I think about like a near enemy. One example of a near enemy to me is we all know, or probably have heard, what we can agree to some extent can be a really toxic message around, quote unquote, nothing tastes as good as skinny feels. That is like one of the most diet culture mantras ever. Nothing tastes as good as skinny feels. And, the message behind that is that, being skinny and thin feels so good that, nothing is worth eating because skinny is the goal. And I think that, that's a super fucked up thing to say. And it's not at all healthy or helpful if what you want is like holistic healing. So then it gets a little complicated though, because what then happens if I'll speak for myself. I have had experiences where maybe I'm thinking about my long-term goal of intentional weight loss. And so because I have this goal of intentional weight loss, I'm going to choose to not eat that dessert, because if I eat the dessert, as I keep sharing as an example, that dessert is going to blow the calorie deficit and maybe put me into maintenance or a surplus. And I don't want those things because I know where I'm headed and I know that it's a numbers game. So in that moment of I'm saying no to dessert because of my goal of weight loss, because I have internalized the message that I am bad and I am guilty and I am not trustworthy. And just like the guy at the Q&A who said, are you sure that you should really be? Because I've internalized that and now I judge and I fear myself. Now I'm sitting there aligned with my goals, making decisions that are in alignment with my values and where I want to go for myself. I'm staying in alignment with me, but what's going through my head is, am I just doing that thing? Am I just doing that diet culture thing? Is this being driven by that old part of me that says nothing tastes as good as skinny feels? I'm sitting here saying no to my dessert. Is it because I believe that still? Is there something wrong with me? Is this a problem? I'm being bad again, aren't I? Anti-diet culture says I shouldn't be doing things like this. Anti-diet culture says, fuck it, eat the dessert. So, what I have replaced that with in my own head for my own sake and well-being, you can take the best and leave the rest, always, is what I started saying to myself at a certain point was, nothing tastes as good as staying in alignment with myself feels. This isn't about being skinny. This isn't about being thin. Maybe I have the goal of intentional weight loss, sure. But in this moment, I'm not saying no to that food because nothing tastes as good as skinny feels. I'm saying no to that food because I want to honor myself and my goals and my commitment. And nothing tastes as good as me aligning with myself. And there are moments that I've had where I will say it actually feels better to me to say no to this food because I know exactly what I want. I know how I want the math at the end of the day. And I'm making decisions aligned with that. Does that necessarily mean it's an eating disorder? No. Does that necessarily mean there's something wrong with me? No. Does it necessarily mean that I'm doing anything bad or wrong? No. But there are so many of these near enemies that we are not clear on. And again, if we are taking in the message from our culture and our society that basically says no matter what you do, you're doing it wrong, that's what we're going to find. That's what we're going to find. But if you know, this is why for episodes, I'm talking to you about connecting your intention to your choices, your intention to your behaviors. Why are you doing what you're doing? If you know that this is because of where you want to take yourself, it's all optional. You don't have to go in that direction, but this is what you want for yourself. You want to be really clear that those are moments of nothing tastes as good as aligning with yourself feels. And that could even be about eating more. It doesn't always have to be about eating less. The whole point is that you're staying in alignment with you and your own goals and your values. And you need to know that if you are innocent, if you are truly pure and good and well-intentioned, that's okay, my friend. That is okay. Okay, so I just went on a little bit of a rant. I'm going to get back to what I wanted to read you. It says, I also think the revised example is a much stronger than, like I just said, nothing tastes as good as skinny feels. Nothing tastes as good as staying in integrity with the commitment I made to myself. Notice how the object changed. The first is about earning a body. The second is about becoming a person. One locates worth in an outcome. The other locates peace in congruence. That feels like the heart of what you're teaching. Another thing that I thought was just so powerful about this, what it wrote, the near enemy of healing is imitation. I think that's so good and so I'm just thinking of Instagram, like as I say that, because there is so much imitation happening on social media in general. But this is what I want you to hear, especially if this resonates with you around diet culture, anti-diet culture. We become so afraid of repeating unhealthy patterns that we start rejecting healthy ones simply because they resemble them on the surface. Healing isn't about avoiding behaviors that once accompanied shame. It's about transforming the consciousness from which those behaviors arise. So this is why, again, for me, it's not just about anti-diet culture, but in a lot of ways, I have to say, as I have been, it is also about my experience of mainstream traditional eating disorder treatment. Is, you know, if you have that thought, if you have that feeling, if you have that urge or craving, that's it. Just shut it down. It's bad. It's bad. It's fundamentally bad, and we can't act on it, and we don't want to connect with it. And I really don't think that that's a lifelong sustainable solution to these kinds of things. So instead of seeing those things and fearing them and judging them, I have an urge to restrict myself because I got on the scale and I didn't like what it said, for example. Yeah, okay. Let's be with that. Let's be with that. Let's get to know that. And this is where parts work comes in. Parts work and IFS, by the way, created for eating disorders. That's where this stuff comes in. That is, okay, let's get to know it. Let's be curious about it. Let's replace the fear of it with curiosity about it. And now we can get into a conversation and get a little bit deeper with it. So what I'm saying to you is, ultimately, if you want something like intentional weight loss, but there are a lot of these things you're going to have to do for intentional weight loss that remind you of dieting, instead of judging it and fearing it, now we can turn toward it and be clear, okay, the intention is innocent. The intention is innocent. And if I know that the reason that I did some of these really harmful things in the past, again, the behavior is not always harmless. Sometimes the behavior is harmful. But if I know that some of the reasons or the reason that I did these harmful things was coming from an innocent place, okay, now I can be the parent that says, hey, your ice powers, Elsa, are not the problem. Now it's my responsibility to work with you, to support you in learning how to channel those things and how to use those things. And the reason that for me it comes back to magic powers is because this is about power, you guys. This is about using your power. You have to have power to make decisions, to make choices, to design the life you want to live. It's coming from power. And so we have powers. We do. But we are afraid of our power, again, because of where we've taken it in the past, what it's done in the past to ourselves, to other people. And now it's about understanding it was innocent. It was innocent. So now the question becomes, how do I see myself as innocent? How do I treat and meet and attune to myself as an innocent being? And also take responsibility for channeling the power I have in a way that's actually going to be safe and sustainable. And now that it's over an hour, I'm going to wrap this up today with something that I will come back to, obviously. But what I want to, again, leave you with and plant the seed for the second time, kind of in a little bit of a different way, is what does it mean then if we bring it back to food noise? What does it mean then if we bring it back to food noise? Because as I will come back and say more about, I think that we've just gone kind of all or nothing with it. And so, like I said a few episodes ago, there was a point in time where I realized, wait, if I care about my health and fitness, then I have to think about food. It's not realistic for me to think I'm going to go the rest of my life without thinking about food. Of course I have to think about food. But so where does food noise fit in to your life? What does it mean to be pathologically thinking about food too much? But also, is the goal really to never think about food at all? Or is it somewhere in between that we haven't really found yet? And so I think this is one of those things where the near enemy framework can help conceptualize it. Because, again, when we are really in a diet culture mindset, maybe you're thinking about food all the time. And so it can feel like the goal becomes not thinking about food at all. And that if you're thinking about food at all, then it's food noise. And food noise is pathological. That's what I've heard a lot of is, but I think about food. And it's like, okay, well, what I want to suggest to you is there is that middle ground where it's not about what you're doing. It's about the relationship with it and the energy around it. And so that's kind of where all this is going, is like there are a lot of things I'm noticing really that could exist kind of in the middle of that Venn diagram. But as I'm talking to you about safe, sustainable, intentional weight loss, I think it can be helpful to kind of itemize. Like, these are all the things. Maybe you're assuming that structure equals dieting. Maybe you're assuming that accountability equals shame. Maybe, right, they're just the really near enemies showing up, which are the reason that it doesn't feel safe to go where you want to go. So that's why I need to clarify them. And I will come back and do exactly that. So, all of that being said, that's where I'm going to leave it for now. I hope you find this as compelling and fascinating as I do. I really do. Final reminder, share the pod. Please share the pod for those of you that need it or have friends, family, clients, loved ones, acquaintances, coworkers, anyone that might benefit. Please share this, rate, review, and subscribe as well. And I will see you on the Patreon, and I will see you next week. I love you. Goodbye.